Welcome to Employment Law Today. My name is Eric Sauver from the law offices of Eric M. Sauver. I'm an employment law and business law attorney, and I'm also the host of this weekly show that meets on Tuesdays, 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the purposes of my show, Employment Law Today, are threefold. One, the first part is to inform and educate our audience, our listeners, mainly small to mid-sized businesses, companies, and startups, so that they have an idea as to what's going on in the world of labor and employment law and how that impacts them, particularly now in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the second part of my show has been to provide resources from other trusted advisors who can help guide your business through the pandemic in other areas, such as video marketing or cybersecurity, financial planning, and other legal considerations. And the third part of my show has been to inspire and motivate my audience and listeners through the experiences of our guests. So, with that background in mind, I'm very pleased tonight to introduce a fellow attorney who also specializes in employment law and business law. She is also a mediator and a dispute resolution specialist. I'd like to welcome Lisa Renee Pomerantz to the show. Lisa, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on tonight.
I'm delighted to be here, Eric. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I thought I would just follow up my introduction by reading a brief summary of your, I'm very impressive by add background and bio, so that our listeners tonight can understand whom they're listening to and the wealth of experience that you bring to the table. So without further ado, I'll say Lisa Renee Pomerantz has more than 35 years of legal and dispute resolution experience. After graduating from Harvard University and Boston University Law School, Lisa clerked for a federal judge, and she worked for 15 years as a senior level in-house counsel for a major corporation. For the past 17 years, since 2003, Lisa has practiced law in Suffolk County. She has her own law practice and works primarily with entrepreneurs and on commercial and corporate matters to resolve business and employment disputes amicably and cost effectively. Attorney Lisa Pomerantz serves on the AAA, that's the American Arbitration Association's roster of neutrals, as a commercial, employment, and consumer mediator and arbitrator. She has served in a variety of leadership roles as well with the Association for Conflict Resolution, the New York State Dispute Resolution Association, and the Suffolk County Bar Association. Lisa is also on the Eastern District of New York's EDNY Mediation Panel and the EDNY ADR Advisory Council. And Lisa mediates workplace disputes for MWI, a Boston-based mediation firm. So I think there you have it, folks, in a nutshell. Lisa, you and I, as you know, share some commonalities. I don't do as much, clearly I'm not a certified arbitrator or mediator per se, but I certainly do represent clients in mediation, and I know we both practice employment law and business law for small to mid-sized companies out there. So it's nice to have a fellow counsel on the call.
Thanks very much. I don't remember exactly how we met, but I think we noticed the commonalities right away.
I think so too. Yes. How did we meet? It's a good question, but I do know we had.
I don't.
Right. And so with that, folks, I'd like to take us on to our topic for the evening. Each week we have a different topic that's relevant again to business owners. And might I add, these topics, while very, very relevant during the pandemic, are equally present, I should say, in times pre-COVID. So I don't want people to think that some of these topics are all brand new and just started in mid-March of 2020. It's just that with the pandemic and the impact on the workplace and on certain people working from home and so forth, that what's happened is a lot of the labor and employment law issues have been exacerbated. So that kind of segues nicely into our topic for tonight, which is how COVID-19 has further blurred the boundaries between personal and professional life and the impact, particularly in a disparate way, on women in the workplace, whether employees or whether employers or women-owned businesses, etc. And I'll just say that with each decade of technological advances, it's become easier for employers to communicate with employees off the clock and to see their personal lives on display. We all know how employers these days can text, email, or chat with employees at any time, though you should be cautious about that when it comes to overtime laws, as Lisa and I know, but can do so. And most people are hooked to their smartphones and iPhones and tablets and other devices. And then social media connections, of course, showcase our personal views, our recreation, and our professional accomplishments as well, including those on display between us and our coworkers, us and our employees or employers, depending upon where you stand. And maintaining that separation between one's professional and personal life has become more challenging. So now enter the COVID-19 pandemic that we've all heard of by now, of course. Employers and employees alike, right, on Zoom calls from their homes, very often with children or an unwitting Zoom bombing spouse eating a bowl of cereal in the background. If it's a morning meeting, I've seen some of those. I may have even been some of those, so I apologize to my wife at home if I ever crossed the path of her meeting. But as our homes have become de facto offices and workspaces, maintaining the boundary between personal and professional life has become very difficult, especially, again, for female employees, but children, as they often find themselves in that predicament of juggling parental duties, childcare, homeschooling, and work all at once. So today, Lisa and I will explore some of these problematic aspects of this blurring of boundaries, these blurred roles, and the toll it takes on employers and employees alike, and the potential for inappropriate behavior, for violation of confidentiality, and other possible legal issues that might arise. We'll also discuss some tips for employers and policies and how to better maintain boundaries between our personal and professional lives. I'm going to take a pause, let that all sink in for our listeners tonight. So, the basic crux of it is boundaries have been blurred and the pandemic's made it worse. So, Lisa, if I may ask you perhaps our first question, whenever there's an issue, I like to ask why. What's the problem? So, question number one would be why is the blurring of personal and professional lives for employers and employees problematic from a employer liability perspective?
Well, I think it's interesting. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen a trend towards employees working remotely.
Mhm.
But when that's happened, it's typically been exempt employees. And it has typically been something that's been planned out in advance. So often you have a telecommuting policy in place that governs whether or not the employee has to have a separate office, whose device they're going to use. It may cover insurance issues, and whether the employee can use their own devices or their own networks. So it's usually planned out in advance. So I think what's happened with the pandemic is, number one, people had to make a switch very suddenly without having the chance to plan, number one. And number two, that you had different categories of employees working remotely. You had employees working remotely who you normally wouldn't allow to work remotely, secretaries, receptionists, etc. And I've been thinking about, we've been reading in the news that the impact on women is so much more substantial. And I think part of this is that with people working remotely, you may find a decline in demand for those very non-exempt employees like receptionists and administrative personnel, because when people are working remotely, they don't make as much use of them, or they don't need them as much, etc. So, and we know that within families that child care burdens, etc., tend to fall more heavily on women. So I think we have a confluence of factors that's leading to both voluntary and involuntary loss of women employees from the workplace.
Right. I would agree with that too, an assessment. And I've seen that as well from sort of looking at some of my own clients when they came to me with, let's say, the furloughs that they were doing, the layoffs based on economic considerations. And I saw often a disproportionate, and it's interesting, a disproportionate amount of people often female. And some of those people were in, as you mentioned, administrative roles, administrative assistants, secretarial, which still tend to be female dominated, though there certainly are men in those fields. But so we have, as you said, right, the cutting of women from the workforce. And then what I've personally seen, not only from a professional point of view, but from a personal, just from knowing colleagues and folks my age, my wife's age, friends of hers who are working moms with small children, as I think you wisely pointed out, that with people at home, I would add that even if there's not, let's say, an overt discriminatory policy in place, let's say an employer says, hey, men and women alike can work from home, or people can start coming back to work. But it's been my observation that if, let's say, the parenting duties tend to fall more heavily on moms, especially with young children, then they might be missing out on opportunities to advance their career. So, the law might say they have a right to take paid leave, paid family leave, et cetera, and they might take that leave. But then they might fall behind their male counterparts, their male colleagues, if they're not billing certain hours or they're not meeting certain metrics. So I think that's another aspect for business owners to consider. We have women in that predicament.
Yes, and I think it's interesting because I believe after the 2008 financial crisis, that actually they found that women were retaining their positions and men were not, because women tended to be compensated less, so that they were of greater value to the workplace. So it's interesting that the trend has been, different. And I think that the factors you've identified, are largely what's at work here. And plus, remote working has stimulated the demand for IT professionals. And again, that tends to be a field where you have a concentration of men.
I think it's also another good point there. Yes. And I think, as we were discussing, I think in our own conversations previously, the issues that come up, you mentioned the issue of people working from home remotely and how they weren't necessarily set up to be that way. They just kind of got thrust into it. And what I found with some of my clients, and I tell this to the audience, if you're listening tonight, if you're a business owner, is to be careful about tracking hours for employees who are covered by the FLSA and the New York labor laws overtime provisions. Would you agree, Lisa? Because
I think you're absolutely right. And it's especially the case. I mean, we know, in fact, I just mediated a case about this very topic, that employers must pay employees for all time worked, whether or not the employer required, we're talking about non-exempts, whether or not the employer required them to work those hours. And now you have a situation also where people could be working from home, their work could be interrupted by the childcare duties. They might try to make up for it by working at a later time. So that tracking time worked may be more problematic. And, so employers do need to articulate their policy about, whether or not employees are limited in the amount of hours that they're allowed to work, and how it is that they have to record the hours that they are working.
That's a really interesting point, and I want to say that we have to take a commercial break right now. When we come back, we can talk more about that and other issues that have arisen with this pandemic. So everyone stick around. Here at Employment Law Today, I'm Eric Sauver, host of the show. My guest is attorney Lisa Renee Pomerantz, and we're here on talkradio.nyc. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Do you love or are you intrigued about New York City and its neighborhoods? I'm Jeff Goodman, host of Rediscovering New York, a weekly show that showcases New York's history and its extraordinary neighborhoods. Every Tuesday live at 7 p.m., we focus on a particular neighborhood and explore its history, its vibe, its feel, and its energy. Tune in live every Tuesday at 7 p.m. on talkradio.nyc.
Hey, all you listeners, looking to boost your business? Why not advertise on Talk Radio NYC with very reasonable rates? Interested? Simply send us a message on our website, talkradio.nyc.
Hi, I'm Graham Dobbin. Join me every Thursday evening for the Mind Behind Leadership here on talkradio.nyc. We speak to people from business, sport, military and politics, all around what makes a great leader, the personal experiences of what's worked and maybe more importantly, what hasn't worked. So that's 7 o'clock every Thursday evening, the Mind Behind Leadership here on talkradio.nyc. Listen to real stories of real leaders.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift, educate, empower.
To Employment Law Today here on Talk Radio NYC. I'm your host, Eric Sauver, employment law, business law attorney, and founder of the Law Offices of Eric M. Sauver. I'm here again tonight with my guest, fellow attorney, also employment law, business law attorney, and certified mediator and dispute resolution specialist, Lisa Pomerantz, attorney at law. Lisa and I were just, for those that may have joined us late, Lisa and I were just discussing some of the ramifications of the blurring of personal and professional lives, especially between employers and employees, now that we're in this pandemic. We talked a little bit about the working from home and telecommuting and how that impacts issues around overtime violations that one has to watch for. Lisa started to talk about, I think, some confidential information that, I think I heard you mention employers have to protect. And so I wanted to ask, maybe if we can backtrack a bit, because that's an interesting point you raised, Lisa, earlier in our program, the difficulty of employers protecting confidential information from employees using their personal devices. Can you share a little bit more about that in terms of what you've seen and maybe some good recommended solutions companies can have?
Sure. There's been a trend, I don't know whether it's good or bad, towards allowing employees to use their own personal devices, computers and phones. And I think there's some challenges in that general practice, but before the pandemic, if employers were going to do that, they could enact a bring your own, it's called a BYOD policy, bring your own device. And they could require, for example, that access to company files be password protected. They could establish what it was that the employee had a right to expect privacy in. They could have ground rules about where documents were going to be stored. Like, even if you were using your personal computer, you would have to store them, on the company networks, etc.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, people are working from home and they're storing confidential information on their personal computers. They're leaving, they could have roommates or spouses, and they're leaving documents around. They're having phone calls or Zoom calls, settings that are not confidential, but discussing confidential information. And we know that employers can only protect as confidential information that they maintain as confidential. And I just don't even think that employees are aware of these issues.
Right.
So, my recommendation for an employer would be to have a policy on the use of personal devices in the workplace, and excuse me, working from home, and requirements that documents be put away, that access be password protected, and that you do what you can to have your calls in private.
I agree 100% with that. And I think it's definitely a challenge, but as you mentioned, even if you're working on your own laptop from, let's say, the office, you bring it in, as you mentioned, you have servers and also you have tech people that can ensure certain devices are kept in check. I know a lot of companies that are my clients will have a policy whereby if a person used their personal laptop and that they consent to certain, let's say, files, being reviewed by the company when they leave the
Absolutely.
right? That's something I put in the standard clause. And also confidential information, one of the main parts of any NDA is that if the information is made open and public to a third party, it often can lose its confidential.
Exactly. And interestingly on this, I just received, I also teach at Toro Law School, and I received from Toro an offer that they would subsidize my purchase of a separate laptop, because I'm teaching from home and they're concerned in some households, people are sharing computers. I mean, that's not in my household, but they, wanted to get away from instructors using their own laptops because student information is confidential.
Absolutely.
And they have very strict requirements also that we have to use our Toro email address, and that they have a platform that all files need to go through that. And I think that sets a good example, and that's the kind of thing that other employers could consider doing as well.
It's interesting because I tend to agree with you. I think that Turo has a good idea there. It's a sound policy to have employers tell their employees, look, we're going to provide you with a separate, distinct laptop while the pandemic's in full swing. You can use that one for work and you use your personal device for everything else. I can envision some people listening tonight, sort of crying out, well, hold on here, we're kind of barely making ends meet with the pandemic. And so how we can't afford that. I have some thoughts about that, but I'm wondering what might you say to a business owner who had that sentiment? We can't afford, it's too expensive.
Well, I can understand, and then you need to have a policy in place and training on the policy. The subsidy from Toro was not substantial, but it turned out the cost of the device was not terribly substantial either. As I said, I didn't take them up on it because I felt for me that I was able to comply, with their privacy requirements, and I am very conscientious about that. I think it's something that employers might take seriously, especially because the cost of not protecting your confidential information can be so great. Right. Because I think this is going to be a time of a lot of turnover, both voluntary and involuntary, of employees leaving or needing to be let go. And you don't want to have your employees walking away with your confidential information. It's not going to be confidential anymore.
Absolutely, yes. No, I tend to agree. I think this is in my mind, this seems like one of those, say, classic scenarios where it's the whole question of being penny wise and pound foolish. If one says, too expensive to go on Amazon and purchase some, maybe not the top of the line model, maybe just an affordable but efficient running laptop for your employees. And because if you're hit with a lawsuit, let's say if you work in a healthcare industry and you have workers at home with HIPAA protected documents who get fired, and maybe they're angry about that and they want to release the information, you can be sued by your clients. It could be bad press. There could be not to mention the fact that an employee who becomes an ex-employee might say, okay, well, I'm going to try to go elsewhere or start my own practice, my own company, and I'm going to use this nifty trade secret, all these different files and information and customer lists to my advantage. So I think having some sort of control and even having servers set up remotely, I think a challenge there, of course, is that with the pandemic, some people are very hesitant to have someone come into their home, let's say a tech person to come into their place and set up an arrangement. And then if they do and someone gets sick from that tech person at COVID-19, is that a liability issue?
Yeah, well, that's another issue because actually the whole under OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Act, employers have a requirement of establishing a safe workplace.
Yes.
And even before the pandemic, OSHA took the position that it was not going to inspect home offices of employees who worked remotely. But I think, but now we have far more people working remotely. And you make a very good point that the nature of the risks they're exposed to is even greater if you have people come in and help them with their technology or deliver things to them, etc. So, we're all navigating, different times. And also there's the whole issue of workers' comp. I mean, in terms of what if somebody is working from home and trips over a cord or something like that, is that covered by workers' comp or not?
It's a big issue, right? And I've heard arguments to both sides, both ways, and also depends. I think one argument people make is that, well, hey, it's still your home. You still have some responsibility to keep it safe and secure, and it's not the office. And others who say, hey, since the employer is forcing you to be there and do your work, and you may have to have now, let's say, all kinds of like new, say, cords and devices, extra outlets. Maybe your outlets were meant for this. So maybe you're in an office where you have 2 screens and a computer and a standing desk. So you now have more clutter, and it's easier to have an accident. So it's these. I think you're right though. One point you made is that these are very much like uncharted times, uncharted waters, and so. My impression, I think, is a lot of employers are trying to do the best they can. And the advice that we're giving them tonight sort of is to be mindful of these issues and to do some further exploration. So keep in mind confidentiality issues, right? Keep in mind workers' comp if you have employees working from home. Update your policy, talk to your insurance provider.
Exactly, because we are going to have these sort of test cases. I mean, and the other thing I would say is that I think the trend to people working from home is not going to end. I do think people will go back to the office, but some of the trends we've seen started before the pandemic and are going to continue after the pandemic.
I tend to agree, yes. It's always a pleasure having fellow employment law attorneys to talk shop with, to talk about these issues, because everything you're saying, these are things I've told my clients who are business owners. I'm sure you tell yours as well. And so it's nice to hear someone sort of mirroring that because some clients are very receptive and they say, this is great information, thank you, it's helpful. Others, sort of balk, get like the example, the recommendation by the employee's laptops, this sort of, well, I'm struggling with sales now and I'm not going to spend money that I don't need to. They have their own computer, let them use it. Everyone has a computer, they say. Who doesn't have a computer in 2020? But it's not the issue of do they have one, it's that will that be segregated? Will that same computer be used at night when they go to sleep when they're 17-year-olds surfing the web, and maybe they're bored and they come across something, or maybe they accidentally share something, on Slack or Snapchat or whatever. And whatever more recent thing than that is, because I'm not a teenager, so I'm very up to speed in all those new found. We have to take a break in a moment. I thought this would be a good breaking point. When we come back, I thought I'd ask Lisa a little bit more about issues of social privacy around social media accounts, how privacy issues come into play in the time of COVID-19 with Zoom calls and people working from home and so forth. So we're going to take a commercial break. Again, I'm Eric Sauver. I'm here on the show Employment Law Today. Tuesdays, 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on the station talkradio.nyc. Stick around, folks, get comfortable. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift, educate, empower.
Are you interested in having a better relationship with yourself, others, and God? Greetings. I'm your host, Dr. George Andow, for the show A Journey Through into Awareness. On my show, we journey into the awareness that the mind of God is the true seat of our personal consciousness. We join together each Monday at 7 p.m., so tune in on Talk Radio NYC.
Are you a conscious co-creator? Are you on a quest to raise your vibration and your consciousness? I'm Sam Leibowitz, your conscious consultant. And on my show, The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, we will touch upon all these topics and more. Listen live at our new time on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time. That's The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, Thursdays, 12 noon on talkradio.nyc.
Are you a curious person, always asking questions? Do you desire to be in the know? Then join me, Antonia, host of So Now You Know, Thursdays at 5 p.m. at talkradio.nyc. Listen in as I attempt to satisfy that curiosity. I will be talking with amazing, everyday people. Join the fun. So Now You Know on Thursdays at 5 p.m. at talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to Employment Law Today. I'm Eric Sarver, host of the show. I'm here every Tuesday night from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. with special guests of mine. And our goal is to educate, inform, and inspire business owners to follow the labor and employment laws and navigate those tricky areas during this pandemic, these uncharted times. I'm here tonight joined by my guest, pardon me, this, attorney Lisa Renee Pomerantz, employment law, business law attorney, and a professional mediator, certified arbitrator as well. Lisa, just to go back into this issue of privacy, we're talking tonight, by the way, about the blurring of professional and personal lines, blurring of boundaries in the workplace, pardon me, and how that's been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I wondered if we could talk a little bit about social media policies. Like, for example, what type of changes might a smart business owner make to their employment or social media policies during the pandemic?
Well, I think just take a step back. There's always been lack of clarity on the part of employees regarding when the employer's policies about how to behave apply.
Right.
So traditionally, problems would arise on things like business trips, people going out for drinks, going to customer events and things like that. And so when I was in-house counsel at NEC, we basically came up with a conduct in the workplace policy that made it clear that the company standards applied whenever you were dealing with customers, other employees, etc. But social media is a funny thing because when people use it, it may be unclear to others as to, are they speaking privately or are they speaking on behalf of the employer?
Right.
And so it's recommended that companies have social media policies which typically say who's authorized to speak on behalf of the employer, who can use the company's social media accounts, etc., for tweeting or posting or whatever. And that employees, if they are posting on social media, they should do so in a way that doesn't suggest that they're speaking for the employer. So I think the same guidelines apply now. It's just that the lines between working and non-working and the hours you're working and the circumstances you're working in are so much more blurred that it's even more confusing as to whether you're speaking for yourself or you're speaking for your employer. But I think that employers should be aware of these issues. I mean, you can have sexual harassment through, social media. And so employers need to establish their expectations of their employees and sort of disabuse them of, just like we had to disabuse people of the notion that when you were on company business, what went on in Vegas did not stay in Vegas. You were still on company business. That now when you're communicating with a customer or a colleague via social media, that you're still, subject, you're still essentially at work and subject to employer prohibitions on sexual harassment or distribution of pornographic materials, etc.
Sure.
So, I mean, I think a lot of it is really just identifying the issue and making the expectations for the employees clear. I know that the New Yorker magazine just had a recent incident where a staff writer engaged in sexual conduct he didn't realize that could be seen on a Zoom call.
I did hear about that too, yes.
Yeah, and I mean, in preparing for our discussion today, I was thinking about other things, like the fact that people are not necessarily dressing in a professional way.
Right.
On Zoom calls, etc., and whether, whether employers might want to consider, if they have dress codes, making it clear that when you're representing the company, you should have a professional appearance.
I think what we're talking about here, first of all, I tend to concur and have the same. I often recommend that during the pandemic, that some of my clients might want to take an additional step and say, if you're going to post personal items, post from your private account, especially now, and here's why I'm personally advising some of my clients, business owners, to be more strict about social media. By the way, I agree with everything you said, all excellent points about everything, like to a T.
You can feel free to disagree.
Oh, and I would if I did, but I sincerely agree with you. I mean, everything about how it's a great analogy too, right? When you're on a business trip, your actions, you can be liable, for sexual harassment. It's not as if because you're not at the office or the store or the restaurant that you work at, just because you're off company grounds does not mean that the employment laws don't apply to you. What I see though is that, two things I see, if I may make some observations. Number one, something you pointed out, when people, say pre-pandemic, most people were working from their office, maybe worked at home 1 or 2 days a week, maybe a small number of employees, right, were telecommuting. But when people come in, people get into the sort of I'm at work mindset by certain, I guess, triggers, like certain, like say events, like trigger like the mind to say, I'm in work mode. So, for many it was, right, getting, showered and shaved, like putting on a button shirt, sport coat, pants, as opposed to wearing sandals and a t-shirt and shorts, or throwing on a button shirt for a Zoom call, and then let's say like going back to like working like shorts and a t-shirt. So, there are those cues that says I'm in work mode. Getting into the office, taking the train, getting your coffee, sitting next to coworkers, being in a cubicle space. And now I think people very much are in a sort of I'm in where am I again mode, right? Because they're home. Some people might be working on their couch from a laptop, where they also tend to relax and watch TV. They might be sending out tweets or liking Facebook posts from the same room that they often use to unwind at night. So, I guess what I'm saying is that the signals in the mind, psyche of I'm at work and this is what's appropriate on social media, or I'm at home and this is what's appropriate, are blurred. So I just always say is now as important as ever for companies to establish stricter guidelines around social media use. On the clock, for example, what you're allowed to post. Certain professions I've noticed have compliance regulations, like in financial advisors, for example, must share certain things they want to tweet with compliance or run it by them before
Yes.
they send it out. And I think that's not a bad idea. I wonder what you think about, let's say, a company having some sort of, maybe not super strict, but informal compliance. Like, hey, if you're going to tweet about issues involving, personal opinions, et cetera, that you run them by, or do you see a downside to that policy?
Well, I think you have to be careful
Yes.
that you're not trying to censor something that you as the employer don't have a right to censor. Like employees have a right to talk about like conditions of employment.
Exactly.
But, the higher level that an employee is, the more that the employer can regulate that person's conduct. And in fact, in many executive contracts, you have sort of good guy clauses where, the employee has to refrain from engaging in any behavior that would be viewed as detrimental to the employer, and that they have to, before they make any statements on behalf of the company, that they have to have it screened by, legal or whoever the appropriate departments are. So I think you just need to be, again, clear with your employees as to the extent to which they're authorized to speak on behalf of the company or not, who they have to clear it with, and what you would consider, and that they need to, any posting they need to do, they have to do it in a way that it's not attributed to the company if it in fact is not on behalf of the company.
Absolutely. And I think it's a very good point. I've actually spoken about this and written about this point too, where you have to be careful, right? Because as you mentioned, there are some forms of protected speech. So let's say if employees are getting on social media and talking in their personal voice, but about problem conditions at the company, like say an unsafe workspace, or hey, I don't really feel safe, people are not wearing masks in the office, what's going on here, that can be viewed as protected activity under the National Labor Relations Act. Protests or conditions, unions kind of formulate, gather people to object to unsafe working conditions. So you don't want to find yourself on the other end of a retaliation suit for firing employees, that type of speech. So this is, definitely an issue where there are pros and cons of, I guess the point of, you can't have a social media policy that's so strict that censors people's protected speech, but also can't be so loose that, especially with higher executives, they're making statements under their professional Twitter account, perhaps like maybe say supporting a very, let's say, radical cause that might, involve certain hatred towards a certain group. And that could be, a stain on the company's reputation. We've all seen in the news, there are people getting fired for, certain remarks, comments they've made that they put underneath right their social media account on LinkedIn or Twitter from the company and not privately. So definitely comes down to these issues of what's protected and what's not, the idea of having separate accounts. And then of course, we get into even more complex areas when some companies encourage their sales force to present a three-dimensional view to the world. They say, listen, we don't want you to be wooden like a statue. So, post on Twitter, post pictures of, funny animals or your kids playing basketball, or, like, hey, isn't that, baseball player amazing? So here we have, on one hand, you can be sending your employees mixed signals, right? Make yourself colorful, but don't speak too personally on the company. It's very confusing.
Exactly. Well, I guess every company has to kind of decide on their own. And actually, the point about social media, the other thing I wanted to mention is that when people are terminated, one of the things that employers need to do is make sure that they terminate their access to any company social media accounts, of course, company networks, etc. And also make sure that the person updates their profile on LinkedIn, etc., so that they no longer are showing as being an employee of the company.
That's an excellent point, Lisa. Yes, exactly. We have to take another commercial break. Time flies when you're having
It
fun.
sure does.
It does. So once again, folks, I'm here with Lisa Renee Pomerantz, employment law and business law attorney, mediator and arbitrator, conflict resolution specialist in the workforce. You're listening to Employment Law Today on talkradio.nyc. I'm your host, Eric Sauver. Stick around. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift, educate, empower.
Are you a small business trying to navigate the COVID-19 related employment laws? Hello, I'm Eric Sauver, employment law business law attorney and host of the new radio show, Employment Law Today. On my show, we'll have guests to discuss the common employment law challenges business owners are facing during these trying times. Tune in on Tuesday evenings from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time on talkradio.nyc.
Are you a business owner? Do you want to be a business owner? Do you work with business owners? Hi, I'm Stephen Fry, your small and medium-sized business or SMB guy, and I'm the host of the new show, Always Friday. While I love to have fun on my show, we take those Friday feelings of freedom and clarity to discuss popular topics on the minds of SMBs today. Please join me and my various special guests on Friday at 11 a.m. on talkradio.nyc.
Do you run or are ready to open your own business? Hi, I'm Jeremiah Fox. I've been operating and opening small business for the last 25 years, and I'm the host of the new show, The Entrepreneurial Web. Tune in every Friday at noon Eastern Time for insights and stories on the nuances of running small business right here on Fridays at noon, talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to Employment Law Today. I'm Eric Sauver from the law office Eric M. Sauver. I help small and mid-sized businesses with issues of employment law and business law. And I'm here tonight with my colleague and fellow employment law business law attorney who has her own practice, also a certified mediator and arbitrator, Lisa Renee Pomerantz. Lisa, thank you once again for being on the show.
My pleasure.
And, I thought this might be a good time to kind of like just, if I may share some of my thoughts based on what we've been discussing, a few takeaways. I try to put myself in the audience's shoes if I can. In other words, if I were not an employment law business law attorney and I were listening to this show tonight, what might my feeling be listening? Do I feel at ease? Do I feel more clarity? Do I feel more confused? So I just wanted to say to anyone listening out there that there aren't really black and white, easy yes or no answers to a lot of these issues around social media policies for your employees, around working from home, if it's covered by injuries covered by workers' compensation claims or not. So there's a lot of gray area, and there's a lot of really not sure. There's not a specific bright line rule to follow in a lot of situations. And that's what I'm hearing from Lisa as well. Is that fair to say that that's kind of a...
I would say so. No, I mean, there certainly are things that are cut and dry, like
sexual harassment.
Is the employee entitled to some kind of paid leave while their child is quarantining home from school? So there are certain issues that are clear cut.
Yes.
But otherwise, I think the law is figuring out how to adapt to new circumstances.
Right, and for sure, a lot of the legal issues that the pandemic makes it very clear about paid family leave or emergency paid sick leave in some situations, but certainly in terms of the blurred personal and professional boundaries and things like privacy policies or work from home, I think the law is trying to sort of figure this out and catch up. I just wanted employer business owners to know that one of the goals of tonight's show is to make you aware that these issues, even are there, they exist, so that you can seek out further counsel. You can, for example, reach out to Lisa, especially if you're out in Long Island or Lisa's in Suffolk County. Although these days with Zoom, it seems like, I've had clients call me from, Scarsdale and further up, but it normally wouldn't be perhaps calling a New York City-based lawyer. But the point, I think, is to make people aware that these are issues. And there are some clear takeaways: having social media policies in place, updating your employee handbooks for another,
Yes.
right? Having perhaps company issued laptops or computers separated for work purposes only. But I think it's just important to kind of note that, these are all issues that we're sort of bringing to light. And then I would encourage business owners to, right, to explore this in more depth.
I concur completely with that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Always fun when we're fellow attorneys that concur with one another. It's kind of, So with that said, and I actually wanted to ask you, Lisa, a question in an area that you're highly specialized in. Now, I know we were talking. I think you mentioned that. You haven't seen any maybe discernible difference in terms of an uptick in conflict before the mediation arbitration. But I'm wondering. Here's my question: do you think that the pandemic conditions might exacerbate future employer-employee conflicts coming to mediation and arbitration?
I think for one thing that you're with greater turnover, especially people being terminated, people are feeling a lot of economic insecurity. And so when they are terminated, they certainly are going to look and see, was this possibly an illegal termination? Was there retaliation involved? And what am I entitled to?
Mm-hmm.
And I've actually been consulted by people who are thinking that they're going to be terminated and wanting to know, what do I need to look at to be prepared for that situation?
Mm.
So it's a good time for people. People often have signed some kind of employee agreements or confidentiality agreements or proprietary rights agreements. I mean, that's another issue that people don't realize, that work product that they create, they might think, oh, I created it at home, it belongs to me, but it might not. It might belong to the employer. That if you are, I would say both for employers and employees, if you're anticipating potential terminations, is think about what are the issues that are going to have to be navigated if that happens.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that too, because I do a handful of cases and representation for employees as well. Of course, barring that there's no conflict of interest with any of my other clients, of course. And
of course, yeah.
right. And I've seen that certainly people come to me and I ask them, well, do you have a contract with your employer? And if the answer is yes, I highly recommend taking a look at that and looking to see, is there a non-compete clause? And if so, is it excessively strict? And given the circumstances, some employers might want to consider letting their employees either out of or non-compete for maybe a certain condition, or perhaps limiting the scope in light of, let's say, massive layoffs, if people are going to be upset by that and have a hard time moving on. So definitely
Yes.
we should consider. I mean, again, we're really in uncharted times here. It's fascinating, to watch this as an attorney and to be a part of this picture, to try, I think our best, for you and speaking, if I may, for yourself and myself, we try, right, to help business owners to get through this time and to follow the law. So I think we covered some great ground tonight. We have about 3 minutes or so until the end of the show. And what I like to do usually here is like say, I just cede the floor to you. I've done plenty of speaking. So I want to know, just any final parting thoughts, or if you want to share a little about any special upcoming events you might have, or you?
Oh, I'd love to. Oh, okay. Sure.
Find you.
Okay. Well, next week is the virtual conference of the New York State Dispute Resolution Association, where I had been on the board for several years. And I'll be speaking there about the value of transparency in mediation. And so, that might be of interest to both attorneys and lay people. So that's coming up. And is this an appropriate time to mention I have my monthly newsletter?
Perfect time to mention.
Yes, called Making the Connection, which features articles on legal and dispute resolution topics.
Okay.
And it's posted on my website at lisapom.com, or you can send me an email and I'll be happy to subscribe you to it. And
if I could jump in, sorry to interrupt you, but just that we have 1 minute to end, so I'll say this. If anyone wants to reach Lisa, am I correct? Your website is lisapom,
lisapom.com. lisapom.com.
Yep. You can find Lisa's telephone, email information, etc. All the info she mentioned in a newsletter. And I just say that I want to thank you sincerely for being on the show. It's been a pleasure to speak to you once again, and to let people know, if you like what you're hearing, tune in Tuesday nights, 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on talkradio.nyc is the station. A lot of good shows on the station, by the way. Shows on Fridays and Thursdays, every night and day of the week, I should add. And so with that, I want to thank you. Again, I'm Eric Sauver from the law office Eric M. Sauver, employment law, business law attorney by day, talk radio DJ by night on Tuesdays. So thanks everyone for being here. Have a great night, Lisa.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
A pleasure. All right, Lisa, have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.